Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Get comfortable, pull the blanket up, turn the lamp down low, because tonight we are going somewhere wonderfully strange, and we are going to take our time getting there. Tonight's topic is one that I think many of you will find personally relatable, because the subject of tonight's exploration is a problem that has apparently plagued human beings for as long as human beings have existed. Insomnia, the inability to sleep, the lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, willing your brain to stop doing whatever it is currently doing and just stop. If you've ever experienced this, and statistically most of you have probably tried a few things. Counting sheep, warm milk, melatonin, a podcast about dull history topics played at low volume. You know, normal things. Medieval people also tried things. They tried a lot of things. And the things they tried were, by any modern measure, extraordinary. Because medieval medicine was a world in which the boundary between the rational and the magical, between the medical and the spiritual, between the practical and the completely unhinged, was not clearly drawn. Everything was a potential remedy. Everything had a theory behind it. And the theory, while frequently incorrect in ways that we can now clearly measure, was always delivered with complete sincerity and considerable authority. Tonight we are going to go through the full catalogue, from the almost sensible herbal preparations that contained real pharmacological compounds, to the physician who recommended staring at a bowl of water until your eyes gave up, to the amulet made from the right eye of a specific type of frog, to the cure involving a boiled preparation that several medieval physicians acknowledged could also simply kill you, which they noted as a side effect worth mentioning. We are going to cover the humoral theory of why you couldn't sleep, the demonic theory of why you couldn't sleep, the dietary theory, the astrological theory, and the theory that blamed your personality type and recommended you simply become a different kind of person as the cure. We are going to meet the physicians who wrote these cures down, the patients who tried them, and the occasional honest medieval medical writer who admitted, with what reads across the centuries as genuine exasperation, that none of this was working and perhaps the patient should simply try being less anxious. So before we begin, if you are new here, welcome. Like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. I love knowing who is out there in the dark. Now, dim the lights. Something outside is making a noise, but it is probably nothing. And let us talk about what people did when they could not sleep, in the centuries before anyone had a reasonable explanation for why sleep happened at all. Before a medieval physician could cure your insomnia, they needed to understand what was causing it. And medieval medicine had a very specific framework for answering this question, one that was elaborate, internally consistent, and wrong in almost every particular, while occasionally stumbling into recommendations that worked for reasons the physicians did not understand. The framework was humoral medicine. 4 humours, 4 qualities, 4 temperaments. An entire explanatory system that had been built by ancient Greek physicians, refined by Roman ones, preserved and elaborated by Islamic scholars, and delivered to medieval Europe in a form that had accumulated several centuries of commentary and had the full authority of ancient tradition behind it. The 4 humours were blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. Each was associated with a pair of qualities, hot or cold, moist or dry. Blood was hot and moist. Phlegm was cold and moist. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. A healthy body had these four in appropriate balance. An unhealthy body had them in imbalance. Disease was imbalance. Treatment was rebalancing. Sleep in this framework was produced by a specific set of conditions in the body. During digestion, vapours rose from the stomach toward the brain. These vapours were moist and cooling in quality. As they accumulated, they produced a sensation of heaviness and the desire to sleep. The brain cooled and moistened. The vital spirits withdrew inward from the external senses. Sleep occurred. Insomnia, therefore, was produced by anything that interfered with this process. The medieval physician diagnosing insomnia was looking for specific humoral imbalances that would explain why the cooling, moistening process was being disrupted. And they found several candidates, each of which produced a different type of sleeplessness, with a different prescribed treatment. The most common cause was an excess of yellow bile, the hot, dry humour. Too much yellow bile heated the brain, dried the vapours before they could do their cooling work, and kept the person in a state of agitated wakefulness. People with a predominantly yellow bile constitution, the choleric temperament in medieval terminology, were considered naturally prone to insomnia. They were described as energetic, quick to anger, quick to enthusiasm, difficult to calm. In modern terms, we might say they had difficulty switching off. The medieval physician would say they were constitutionally too hot and too dry and needed cooling and moistening. The second common cause was black bile, the cold, dry humour associated with melancholy. This one is interesting because the type of sleeplessness attributed to excess black bile looks remarkably like what modern medicine would recognise as insomnia associated with depression and anxiety. The melancholic insomniac lay awake with dark thoughts, with fears, with the inability to stop the mind's activity. Medieval physicians noted that this type of sleeplessness was accompanied by low spirits, fear without obvious cause, and a tendency to wake in distress. The treatment prescribed was warming and moistening, the opposite of the choleric treatment. The third cause was perturbation of the mind, what we might now call psychological distress. Medieval medicine did not have a sharp boundary between physical and psychological causes of illness. The mind and body were understood as intimately connected, and mental disturbance expressed itself physically and was treated physically. Grief, fear, excessive intellectual activity, strong anger, intense desire, all of these could prevent sleep by keeping the vital spirits in a state of agitation that the cooling vapours could not overcome. The fourth cause, and the one that distinguished medieval medicine from any purely secular medical tradition, was supernatural interference. Demons could prevent sleep. The specific demonic entities of the night that we discussed in other contexts were understood as capable of producing insomnia, as well as nightmares and other nocturnal disturbances. And a case of sleeplessness that did not respond to physical treatments was considered evidence of supernatural rather than natural causation, requiring spiritual rather than medical remedies. With all four of these potential causes in mind, the medieval physician approached the insomniac with a set of diagnostic questions designed to determine which type they were dealing with. What had they eaten? When? What was their general temperament? Were they fearful or angry? Had they done anything recently that might have attracted demonic attention? Were there any saints' days on which the sleeplessness had begun? The diagnosis was a comprehensive interview that covered physical, psychological, and spiritual territory simultaneously. And then the treatment began, and the treatment was extraordinary. Let's start with the herbs, because herbal medicine was the foundation of medieval insomnia treatment, and the range of what was prescribed runs along a spectrum from the genuinely effective to the genuinely terrifying. At the sensible end of the spectrum, medieval physicians used plants that modern pharmacology has subsequently confirmed as containing real sleep-relevant compounds. Valerian root, known in the medieval period under various names, including setwall and garden heliotrope, was one of the most consistently recommended herbal remedies for sleeplessness across the entire medieval period. It appeared in medical texts from the earliest period through to the late medieval, recommended for its sedative and calming properties, prepared as a decoction or an infusion and drunk warm before sleep. Whether valerian actually works is a question that modern sleep research has been investigating with inconclusive but somewhat positive results. The plant contains compounds including valerianic acid and various other active constituents that appear to interact with GABA receptors in the brain, the same receptor system targeted by pharmaceutical sedatives. Though at much lower potency, the medieval physicians who recommended it were working entirely from observed effect rather than understood mechanism, but the observed effect was real enough to keep valerian in the sleep remedy pharmacopoeia for over 1,000 years. Chamomile was similarly consistent in the medieval herbal tradition, recommended as a warm drink before sleep, as a preparation added to the bathwater, and as an aromatic placed near the sleeping space. Chamomile contains apigenin, a compound that binds to benzodiazepine receptors in the brain and produces mild sedative effects. Again, the mechanism was entirely unknown to medieval physicians. The effect was observed and recorded. The recommendation was maintained. Lavender, hops, lemon balm, passion flower. All of these plants appear in medieval sleep remedy literature, and all of them have some degree of pharmacological support for the claims made for them. Medieval herbal medicine, at its practical core, was a several centuries long empirical observation of which plants produced which effects, and in the area of sleep remedies, it had accumulated genuinely useful information even without any correct understanding of why any of it worked. Then we move along the spectrum toward the more complicated preparations. Lettuce, specifically wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa, rather than the salad variety, was widely recommended in medieval medicine as a sleep aid. The plant contains lactucarium, a milky substance sometimes called lettuce opium, which has mild sedative properties. Preparations of lettuce for sleeplessness ranged from eating the plant itself to applying the expressed juice to the temples to drinking preparations made from the dried seed heads. The plant was considered cooling and moistening in its humoral qualities, making it theoretically perfect for the hot, dry insomnia of choleric types. Wild lettuce preparations were not particularly dangerous at the doses typically used in herbal medicine. What was dangerous was the tendency of medieval medical preparations to combine multiple sedative herbs in single preparations, on the theory that more sedative ingredients would produce more sedation. Sometimes this theory was correct. Sometimes it was very, very correct in ways that were medically catastrophic. The soporific sponge, a preparation described in medieval surgical texts as an anaesthetic for surgical procedures, is the most extreme example of this additive logic. A sponge soaked in a preparation containing opium, mandrake, henbane, hemlock, and various other plants, then dried and stored, and reconstituted with water and held under the patient's nose when unconsciousness was required. This preparation worked. It worked in the sense of producing unconsciousness. It worked in the sense that the patient did not feel what the surgeon was doing. It also occasionally worked in the sense of producing unconsciousness from which the patient did not return. Medieval physicians knew this. The texts that describe the soporific sponge also describe antidotes for when the patient had been given too much. Preparations of vinegar applied to the nose, or the application of cold water, intended to reverse the sedation. The existence of the antidote in the same text as the preparation tells you that the need for it was anticipated, which tells you something important about the margins of safety involved. Now, the soporific sponge was a surgical tool, not a routine insomnia remedy, but some of its constituent plants, opium, mandrake and henbane in particular, did appear in insomnia remedies at lower doses, and the dose was not a precisely calibrated quantity. It was a handful of dried herb. It was a preparation made according to a recipe that did not specify weights and measures with any modern precision. The same preparation, made by different hands from plants of varying potency, could produce effects ranging from mild drowsiness to profound unconsciousness to death. Opium, prepared from the poppy plant that grew across the medieval Mediterranean world, was used in medieval medicine with a casualness that reflects both its genuine effectiveness and the period's imprecise understanding of what it was. It was prescribed for pain, for fever, for anxiety, for cough, and for sleeplessness. It worked for all of these things, and it was also addictive and potentially lethal in overdose, neither of which facts was clearly understood in the medieval period. The physician who prescribed an opium preparation for insomnia was prescribing the medieval equivalent of a powerful opioid sleeping medication, but without the dosage calibration, the contraindication warnings, or the understanding that regular use produced dependency. Mandrake, the plant with the forked root that medieval folklore said screamed when pulled from the ground and killed anyone who heard the scream, was a real medical plant with real pharmacological properties. The root contains tropane alkaloids, including atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. These compounds are genuinely sedative and genuinely dangerous. Mandrake preparations were used in medieval medicine for pain relief, for sleep, and for what the texts describe as producing a period of insensibility. They were also used at higher doses to kill people, and several medieval murder cases involve mandrake as the agent. The physician prescribing mandrake for insomnia and the poisoner using mandrake for elimination were working with the same plant and, uncomfortably, sometimes with similar preparations. Henbane, the third member of this uncomfortable trio, contains the same class of tropane alkaloids as mandrake. It was used medicinally for pain, for insanity, and for sleeplessness. Its effects include hallucination, disorientation, extreme sedation, and death in overdose. Medieval physicians noted that patients given henbane preparations sometimes experienced disturbing visions, which they attributed to the humoral effects of the plant on the brain rather than to the pharmacological reality of psychoactive alkaloids. The patient who lay awake worrying and was given a henbane preparation before bed either slept, hallucinated interestingly, or did not wake up. The physician hoped for the first outcome and noted the others as unfortunate. Medieval insomnia treatment was not limited to herbal preparations. The dietary approach was equally important because in a system where imbalanced humours cause sleeplessness, the foods that adjusted humoral balance were as medically significant as any herb. The dietary management of insomnia in the medieval period was extraordinarily detailed. Medieval medical writers produced extensive lists of foods classified by their humoral qualities, hot or cold, moist or dry in varying degrees of intensity. And the insomniac was directed to eat foods whose qualities would correct whatever imbalance was causing their sleeplessness. For the choleric insomniac whose sleeplessness was caused by excess heat and dryness, the dietary prescription was cooling, moistening foods. This meant specific fruits and vegetables that were classified as cold and moist in the humoral system. Lettuce, as we have already encountered, was practically a prescription food for this type. Cucumber was cooling. Melon was cooling. Barley was cooling. A diet based around these foods, taken in the evenings and particularly at supper, was considered therapeutic for heat-based insomnia. What was to be avoided was equally specific. Onions were heating. Garlic was very heating. Leeks were heating. Strong spices, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, were heating to a significant degree. Red meat was heating and drying. Wine, particularly red wine, was heating. For the person whose insomnia was caused by excess heat, a supper of spiced meat with wine, followed by garlic and onions, was essentially a medical disaster. Everything the physician would have told them to avoid, accumulated in a single meal. The irony is that this was exactly the kind of supper that a prosperous medieval person might eat on a regular basis. The wealthy table of the medieval period was characterized by exactly the foods that humoral medicine identified as heat-producing: meat, wine, strong spices imported at great expense to demonstrate the host's wealth and sophistication. The prosperity that allowed you to afford a physician to treat your insomnia was the same prosperity that produced the diet most likely to cause it, according to that physician's own diagnostic framework. For the melancholic insomniac, the dietary prescription was warming and moistening. This meant warm, gentle, easily digested foods. Chicken broth was almost universally recommended. Soft, warm, moistening, nourishing without being stimulating. White bread soaked in warm milk or broth. Almond milk preparations, which were both warming and nourishing. Eggs, softly cooked. These are foods that a modern nutritionist would recognise as easily digestible and unlikely to cause digestive disruption, which is to say the dietary recommendation was reasonable even if the theoretical justification was entirely wrong. Specific beverages were recommended and prescribed with equal specificity. Warm drinks were generally considered sleep-promoting because warmth itself was associated with the moistening process that produced sleep. A warm drink before bed facilitated digestion, raised the gentle vapours that the brain needed, and prepared the body for the transition into sleep. Cold drinks did the opposite. They constricted the digestive process, reduced the vapour production, and kept the body in a state too tense for sleep. Warm ale with specific additions was a common bedtime drink among the medieval English. Ale itself was a staple beverage, more reliable than water, more affordable than wine, caloric and mildly alcoholic. Warmed, it produced genuine physiological effects. The warmth promoted digestion and body temperature regulation, and the mild alcohol content had the sedative effect that alcohol does produce at low doses. The additions that medical recipes specified varied. Some added warming spices, some added specific herbs, some added honey. The combination of warm liquid, mild alcohol, and herbal additions to many of these preparations produced something that, at appropriate doses, could genuinely facilitate sleep onset. Warm milk was recommended, as it has been in virtually every culture and every era, with a persistence that suggests there is something to it. Medieval physicians attributed the sleep-promoting quality of warm milk to its cold and moist humoral character. Milk was classified as cold and moist, making it theoretically ideal for the hot, dry insomniac. The actual reason warm milk may facilitate sleep is more complex and less clearly established by modern research than the popular wisdom suggests, but the recommendation has survived from the medieval period to the present, which is the kind of durability that suggests at least some people found it helpful. The most elaborate dietary insomnia cure in the medieval literature is a preparation described in several English medical manuscripts as a soporific electuary, a thick, honey-based preparation containing multiple medicinal ingredients designed to be eaten by the spoonful before sleep. The ingredient lists for these preparations vary, but typically include honey as the base, with additions of various sleep-promoting herbs, warming spices in careful proportion so as not to produce excessive heat, and sometimes animal-derived ingredients whose specific contribution was explained in terms of sympathetic magic as much as humoral medicine. One such recipe calls for honey, poppy seed, white henbane seed, and the powdered skull of a man who died a natural death, combined into a paste and taken in a quantity the size of a bean before sleep. The skull powder appears in multiple medieval medical preparations, and its inclusion reflects the doctrine of signatures and sympathetic medicine, the idea that substances derived from the dead could reduce the death-like state of deep sleep. Whether the skull powder did anything is not the interesting question. The interesting question is how you sourced it, and the answer is that there were medieval apothecaries who sold such things, which tells you something rather remarkable about the medieval medical marketplace. Here is a medieval insomnia cure that should feel familiar to anyone who is currently lying in bed listening to the person narrating this script. Medieval physicians and scholars consistently recommended as a remedy for sleeplessness the listening to or reading of texts with a specific quality of monotony. Gentle, slow, rhythmically consistent, intellectually undemanding. The cure for sleeplessness, they suggested, was deliberate boredom delivered at a carefully calibrated pace. This is not a joke. This is documented medical advice in multiple medieval sources. The physician Avicenna, the great Islamic scholar whose canon of medicine was the most authoritative medical text in medieval Europe for several centuries, specifically recommended as a treatment for sleeplessness caused by mental perturbation the quiet recitation of gentle verses. Not exciting verses, not thought-provoking verses. Verses that did not challenge the mind, did not stimulate the passions, and provided just enough sensory engagement to prevent the mind from generating its own agitated content. Other medieval sources recommend the reading aloud of histories, specifically the long and detailed accounts of events in which the outcome was already known, which provided narrative engagement without narrative tension. You know how it ends. Everyone knows how it ends. There is nothing to be anxious about. The story continues its slow, detailed, thoroughly documented course toward its predetermined conclusion, and somewhere in the middle of the third account of who was present at the signing of a treaty, you go to sleep. This is structurally exactly what podcasts and audiobooks and sleep-specific audio content do today. The mechanism that medieval physicians observed and recommended, the use of monotonous, rhythmic, intellectually gentle auditory content to occupy the mind just enough to prevent it from generating anxiety, while failing to stimulate it enough to maintain wakefulness, is the same mechanism that sleep podcasts exploit. They did not have the neuroscience. They had the observation, which was accurate enough to produce a recommendation that has persisted for 1,000 years. The recitation of psalms was a particularly recommended version of this practice, with the added benefit of also being spiritually protective. The slow, rhythmic chanting or recitation of the Psalter, the 150 Psalms of the Old Testament, was both a devotional practice and apparently a reliable sleep aid. The Psalms in the Hebrew original are poetry with strong metrical qualities that translate into the rhythmic character of the Latin Vulgate used in medieval liturgy. Recited slowly, quietly, in the dark, with the monotonous cadence of someone who has said these words every day for years, they have the precise quality that the medieval physicians were prescribing. Rhythmic, familiar, gentle, providing just enough cognitive engagement to occupy the restless mind without stimulating it further. Several medieval monastery accounts describe monks reciting psalms to themselves in bed during periods of sleeplessness. And this practice is described not just as devotional, but as practically effective. The monk who could not sleep would begin the slow internal recitation of familiar psalms, and somewhere in the process would drift into sleep. The familiarity was important. It had to be text that did not require active thought, only the gentle rolling out of memorized words. A new text would engage the mind too directly. An old familiar text created the right kind of gentle occupation. There is a delightful passage in a 13th century medical text that recommends, for the insomniac who has tried all the herbal remedies without success, the hiring of a reader. The reader was to sit beside the bed and read aloud from historical chronicles in a slow, even, expressionless voice, at a pace deliberately slower than normal speech, continuing until the patient was asleep. The author of the medical text notes, with what reads as fond exasperation, that this method required a reader with considerable patience and the ability to suppress all natural narrative expression, since any moment of enthusiasm or vocal variety would undo the work of the preceding half hour. He then adds that for patients of particularly agitated constitution, the reading of lists, inventories, property records, the names of persons present at various historical occasions, was even more effective than narrative text, because lists provided even less narrative tension and even less opportunity for the mind to engage speculatively with what might happen next. You cannot worry about what happens next when what comes next is simply the next item on the inventory. This is the medieval physician inventing the concept of the deliberately boring sleep aid, and doing so with such precision that it maps almost exactly onto the content philosophy of modern sleep podcasts. The things that work, apparently, are the things that have always worked. The explanation of why they work has changed. The recommendation has not. Alongside the dietary and herbal approaches, medieval insomnia treatment maintained a robust tradition of object-based cures. Things you wore, things you placed under your pillow, things you hung above your bed, things you carried on your person, whose sleep-promoting properties were understood through frameworks ranging from the magical to the theological to the mineral. The lodestone was one of the most consistently recommended sleep amulets in medieval literature. A lodestone is a naturally magnetised piece of the mineral magnetite, a stone that has the property of attracting iron, which made it magical in the medieval understanding and scientifically interesting in the modern one. Medieval gem medicine attributed to the lodestone the property of attracting sleep in the same way it attracted iron. If you placed a lodestone under your pillow or near your head, it would draw sleep towards you magnetically. The logic was perfectly consistent with the magical physical framework of medieval mineral medicine. The evidence that it worked is, let us say, limited. The moonstone, a feldspar mineral with a characteristic shimmering quality produced by its internal structure, was associated with the moon in medieval gem medicine, and the moon was associated with the moist and cooling qualities that produce sleep. Wearing a moonstone was therefore a way of bringing the moon's sleep-promoting qualities into direct contact with the body. Moonstone was prescribed specifically for insomniacs of the hot, dry type, those whose excess of heat was preventing the cooling process necessary for sleep. A moonstone worn at the throat or placed under the pillow was considered a gentle, continuous therapeutic intervention in the humoral balance of the sleeper. The right eye of a frog features in multiple medieval folk remedy collections as an insomnia cure. The frog was associated with moisture. It lived in water. It was cold and wet to the touch. It was the very embodiment of the cold, moist qualities that promoted sleep. An amulet made from the right eye of a frog, carried on the person or placed near the bed, was supposed to transfer these cold, moist, sleep-promoting qualities to the insomniac. The method of preparation varied between sources. Some specified a living frog, some a dead one. Some specified the right eye specifically. Some were less particular about laterality. But the principle was consistent. The frog's sleepiness, its watery torpor, its cold-blooded somnolence would transfer to the person carrying its eye. This is sympathetic magic, the idea that like produces like, that objects associated with sleep or with sleep-promoting qualities can transfer those qualities to the insomniac. The same principle applied to several other animal-based amulets in the medieval sleep remedy tradition. The skin of a dormouse, that famously somnolent creature, was sometimes recommended as a material for a sleep pillow or amulet. The bear, which hibernated, appeared in some traditions as a source of sleep-promoting material, the principle was consistent. Obtain something associated with long, deep, reliable sleep and bring it into contact with the person who needed that quality. The bones of the dead appeared in medieval sleep amulets in ways that reflect the same association between death and deep sleep that we encountered in the dietary cures. A piece of bone from a person who had died naturally and peacefully was considered to carry some of the quality of their final sleep, a sleep so complete that waking was not required. Worn as an amulet near the head, this was supposed to promote deep, untroubled rest. The theology of this practice sat in uncomfortable proximity to church teaching about the dignity of the dead and the proper treatment of human remains, which may explain why it appears primarily in folk medicine collections, rather than in the more officially sanctioned medical literature. Iron, which we have already encountered as a protective material against supernatural entities, also appeared in sleep remedies as a protective measure, specifically against the demonic insomnia caused by night creatures. An iron nail driven into the bed frame was recommended in some traditions. Iron scissors placed open under the pillow were recommended in others. The logic was that the iron prevented the supernatural interferer from approaching the bed, removing the supernatural cause of the sleeplessness and allowing natural sleep to occur. Whether or not this worked depended entirely on whether the insomnia actually was supernaturally caused, and the medieval physician who had tried all the humoral remedies without success might reasonably move to the iron nail as the next diagnostic step. Medieval insomnia treatment was not limited to things you ingested or objects you carried. A substantial tradition of physical therapies for sleeplessness existed, and some of them were surprisingly pleasant, while others were considerably more challenging. The bath was a consistent recommendation for sleeplessness caused by excessive heat and dryness, the choleric insomnia type. A warm bath produced a physical cooling and moistening of the body from the outside that complemented the dietary and herbal approaches working from the inside. The warmth of the water promoted the relaxation of tense muscles and the calming of agitated vital spirits. The moisture added to the skin's environment addressed the dryness that the humoral analysis identified as part of the problem. The temperature of the bath was specified with some care in medical literature, warm but not hot. A hot bath would add heat to a constitution that already had too much. The goal was to gently lower the temperature differential between the overheated body and the surrounding air, easing the transition toward the cooler state that sleep required. Certain herbs were added to the bath water for their specific humoral qualities, chamomile, lavender, and rose petals appearing frequently in the bathing recommendations for insomnia. After the bath came the massage. The rubbing of the body with specific oils before sleep was recommended in multiple medical traditions, and the specific oils were chosen for their humoral properties rather than simply their pleasantness. Rose oil was cooling and moistening, ideal for choleric insomnia. Poppy oil was associated with the sleep-promoting poppy plant. Violet oil was cooling. Some preparations combine multiple oils with herbal additives, producing something between a massage oil and a topical medicinal preparation. The specific areas of the body recommended for massage in insomnia treatment are interesting. The feet received special attention. Rubbing the soles of the feet was consistently recommended, on the theory that the feet were the part of the body most distant from the head, and that promoting warmth and circulation in the feet would draw the excess heat down from the overactive brain toward the extremities, cooling the brain to the temperature required for sleep. This is the logic behind the folk wisdom about warm feet and good sleep, which has persisted to the present and which does have some physiological basis in the relationship between peripheral vasodilation, heat redistribution, and sleep onset. The temples were also a focus of topical treatment. The thin skin of the temples was considered to offer relatively direct access to the brain beneath, and preparations applied there were thought to act more directly on the organ most involved in producing and preventing sleep. Cooling preparations applied to the temples were a standard recommendation for heat-based insomnia. The preparation of rosewater and vinegar applied to the temples with a cloth is one of the more frequently recurring recommendations across multiple medieval medical sources, and it has the pleasant quality of being both cooling and mildly aromatic in a way that might genuinely produce some of the relaxation it was supposed to cause. The rubbing of dormouse fat on the soles of the feet deserves its own extended mention because it manages to be simultaneously the most logical and most bizarre of all the physical insomnia remedies. The dormouse was celebrated across the ancient and medieval world for its exceptional somnolence. It hibernated deeply. It was legendarily difficult to wake. It was practically synonymous with sleep in the cultural imagination. The dormouse fat rendered from these remarkable sleepers was considered, by the principles of sympathetic medicine, to carry the dormouse's sleep capacity within it. Applied to the soles of the feet, through which, in medieval anatomical theory, the body could absorb therapeutic substances, it would transfer the dormouse's magnificent sleep directly to the insomniac. Medieval physicians who recommended this treatment did so with complete seriousness. Dormouse fat appears in multiple medical texts as an insomnia remedy, with no indication that the prescribers considered it anything other than a standard medical intervention. The dormouse, having hibernated for 6 months, was regarded as the world's leading authority on sleep, and rendering it into a medical preparation was simply the application of that expertise to a clinical need. Whether it worked is, of course, the question. The answer is that rubbing any oil on the soles of your feet immediately before lying down is a mildly pleasant sensory experience that probably promotes some degree of relaxation. That the oil came from a dormouse rather than from an olive is irrelevant to the mechanism, and the mechanism, warm, gentle physical contact, mild aromatic stimulus, the ritual of preparation, is real regardless of the theory behind it. Medieval medicine and medieval religion did not have the sharp boundary that separates them in modern thinking. The physician who prescribed herbal remedies might equally prescribe prayers, and the prayers were considered medical interventions in the same category as the herbs, tools for correcting imbalances, whether those imbalances were humoral or spiritual. The charm, a spoken or written formula with specific words believed to have direct curative power, was a standard element of the medieval medical toolkit, used by physicians who also used plants and dietary interventions without any sense of inconsistency. The theory behind charms was that words had power, particularly words that had been consecrated by use, by prayer, or by the authority of a spiritual tradition. The right words, spoken in the right context, could influence the physical world because the physical world was not separate from the spiritual world, but continuous with it. The insomnia charm literature is extensive and varied. Many charms for sleep invoke specific saints associated with rest, peace, or healing. Saint Dymphna, the patron saint of those with mental and nervous disorders, appears in insomnia charms, particularly in the later medieval period. Various local saints whose legends involved miraculous healing of nervous complaints were invoked in regional charm traditions. The Virgin Mary, as the ultimate intercessor, appears in sleep charms across the entire medieval European tradition. Some of these charms were spoken over the insomniac by a healer or priest while the patient lay in bed. Others were spoken by the patient themselves as part of their bedtime routine. Others were written on small pieces of parchment and worn as amulets, the written word carrying the same power as the spoken word, in a culture that regarded writing as a form of speech preserved. One category of written charm that appears frequently in medieval manuscripts is the charm for sleep that listed specific names. The names of the 3 kings who visited the infant Jesus in the Nativity narrative, the names of various angels, the names of saints associated with specific protections. Wearing a piece of parchment with these names written on it was considered a continuous prayer, a continuous invocation of the named figures' protective and healing power that worked through the night without requiring the insomniac to be awake to say it. The psalms appear in the charm tradition as well as in the reading for sleep tradition. Specific psalms were associated with specific therapeutic effects, and the psalm for sleep was a recognized category of charm. Psalm 4, which ends with the verse, "I will both lay me down in peace and sleep," was naturally associated with sleep and was recommended to be recited before bed, either as a devotional practice or as a medical charm, or most commonly as both simultaneously. The medical charm and the prayer existed on a continuum without a clear boundary between them. A physician who told a patient to recite Psalm 4 before sleep and then drink a preparation of valerian was giving a complete treatment plan that addressed the spiritual and physical causes of the sleeplessness simultaneously, and the 2 elements of the plan were considered equally medical. The most elaborate insomnia rituals combined physical, herbal, dietary, and charm elements into a comprehensive protocol. A complete treatment plan from a 14th century English medical manuscript recommends the following for a patient with persistent sleeplessness: a dietary adjustment to remove heating foods, a preparation of lettuce and chamomile to be drunk warm at supper, a bath with rose petals and lavender, the application of poppy oil to the temples and soles of the feet, the placement of a lodestone under the pillow, the recitation of Psalm 4 and a specific charm for sleep, and the wearing of a written amulet bearing the names of 3 saints. All of this was to be done in the correct order, on a night when the moon was in a favourable position, beginning with the dietary adjustments several days in advance. If that didn't work, the physician would try something else. Medieval medicine was, if nothing else, persistent. We cannot discuss medieval insomnia treatment without addressing astrology, because astrology was not a fringe belief in the medieval world. It was a mainstream intellectual framework used by physicians, scholars, rulers, and ordinary educated people to understand the timing and causation of events, including events happening in the human body. The basic principle of medical astrology was that the celestial bodies exerted direct physical influence on the earthly world, including the human body, through the medium of astrological forces that acted on the same humoral system that governed all of health and disease. The moon affected moisture, Saturn affected melancholy, Mars affected heat and agitation. Each planet was associated with specific bodily organs, specific humoral qualities, and specific medical conditions. The timing of the onset of sleeplessness was therefore medically significant. A physician who knew when the insomnia had begun could calculate which planetary influence was dominant at that time and adjust the treatment accordingly. Insomnia that began during a period of Martian influence would be treated differently from insomnia that began under a Saturnine influence, even if the presenting symptoms were similar, because the underlying astrological cause required a different corrective. The timing of treatments was also astrologically determined. Herbal preparations were to be prepared when the planets were in favourable positions for the treatment being prepared. Harvesting medicinal herbs at the correct lunar phase was standard practice, and the phase of the moon at which a particular plant was gathered was considered to affect its medicinal potency. Waning moon was associated with reduction and cooling, making it theoretically the correct time to harvest cooling herbs for heat-based insomnia. Waxing moon was associated with increase and growth, making it the time for preparations intended to build up deficient qualities. The specific planetary hours, the ancient system of dividing the day and night into 12 hours, each governed by a specific planet, rotating through the week, were used to time the taking of medicines. Taking a sleep remedy during the hour governed by Saturn, the slowest and most somnolent planet, was considered more effective than taking the same remedy during the hour of Mars, the most active and agitating. A physician who had composed the correct herbal preparation for an insomniac patient would specify not just the preparation, but the time at which it was to be taken, calculated to align with the most favourable planetary hour. The moon's phase was considered particularly important for sleep. The full moon was consistently associated with disturbed sleep across medieval European traditions, and not simply as folk belief. Medical writers address the full moon's effect on sleep as a serious medical question. The theory was that the full moon represented the maximum lunar influence, and the moon governed the moist and cooling qualities. At full moon, this influence was at its strongest, which in healthy amounts promoted good sleep. But at the full moon's excessive intensity could overstimulate the moisture in the brain and produce the kind of unsettled, agitated sleep associated with lunacy. The correct response to full moon insomnia was to block the lunar influence as directly as possible. This meant sleeping away from windows where moonlight could enter. It meant wearing a cap that covered the head thoroughly, particularly the top of the skull through which the lunar rays were considered to enter most directly. It meant avoiding sleeping on the back, which positioned the face upward toward the moon. Some medical texts recommended specific preparations timed to counteract the lunar excess, preparations that would reduce rather than increase the moisture in the brain, temporarily counteracting the full moon's influence. The new moon presented the opposite problem. Minimum lunar influence meant minimum of the cooling, moistening qualities, which for some constitutions meant insufficient promotion of the sleep-inducing vapours. The new moon insomniac needed moisture-promoting remedies rather than moisture-reducing ones. The same herb given at full moon and new moon might therefore have opposite effects, depending on which way the moon's influence was pushing the patient's humoral balance. This is a system of considerable internal complexity, and medieval physicians navigated it with maps, charts and tables that allowed them to calculate planetary positions and hours and phases with reasonable accuracy for the pre-telescope period. The astrological physician was also a mathematician and an astronomer, and the calculations required for full astrological medicine were not trivial. The great medieval universities that taught medicine taught astrology as a component of the medical curriculum, because a physician who did not know the sky could not fully know the body. The animal kingdom contributed substantially to medieval insomnia remedies beyond the dormouse and the frog eye we have already encountered. Medieval medicine drew on animals as sources of medicinal material with an enthusiasm and a creativity that modern pharmaceutical practice has entirely abandoned, and the sleep remedies derived from animals range from the mildly plausible to the memorably strange. The beaver deserves mention because the medieval understanding of the beaver produced one of the more creative medical preparations in the insomnia literature. Medieval natural history attributed to the beaver remarkable qualities, including the ability to remain still in water for extraordinary periods, which was interpreted as a form of sleep. Preparations derived from the beaver, specifically a substance called castoreum, which is a secretion from castor sacs near the base of the beaver's tail, were recommended for multiple conditions, including nervous disorders and sleeplessness. Castoreum does actually contain compounds with some pharmacological activity. It contains salicin, related to the active compound in willow bark, and ultimately to aspirin, which has mild sedative properties. The medieval physician using castoreum for insomnia was using something with real chemistry in it, derived from an animal via a theory that was entirely wrong but accidentally pointed toward a real effect. The hare was associated in medieval natural history with exceptional alertness and exceptional wariness, an animal that was proverbially always watching, always listening, always ready to run. For the insomniac whose problem was exactly this excessive alertness, the hare seemed to offer a sympathetic cure. The brain of a hare, prepared and administered in specific ways, was recommended for sleeplessness by several medieval authors on the grounds that introducing the hare's nervous energy into the patient's system would somehow discharge it, like fighting fire with fire. This is not a convincing theory, but it has a certain bold internal logic. The specific preparation of harebrain varies between sources. Some recommend it eaten, some recommend it applied topically, some recommend it incorporated into an amulet. The one consistent element is that the cure required obtaining the brain of a hare, which required obtaining a hare, which in medieval England was a thing that commoners were not legally permitted to do. Hares were the property of the lord of the manor, and hunting them without permission was poaching. The harebrain insomnia cure was therefore effectively a prescription that only the wealthy could fill. which says something interesting about the class dimensions of elaborate medieval medical care. The owl, that most quintessentially nocturnal of birds, contributed to insomnia remedies through multiple preparation routes. The owl's association with night made it a natural candidate for sympathetic nocturnal medicine. Owl eggs were recommended in some traditions as an ingredient in sleep preparations. The owl who inhabited the night so comfortably would pass some of that comfort to the insomniac who consumed a preparation made from its eggs. Owl fat was recommended in some sources for topical application in the now familiar logic of rubbing the essence of a good sleeper onto the person who couldn't sleep. More dramatically, there are sources that recommend placing a live owl in the bedroom, not as a pet, not as an amulet, but as an active therapeutic presence whose nocturnal ease would influence the sleeping environment. The owl going about its calm, competent nighttime business in the corner of the bedroom was supposed to model and promote the same quality of nighttime ease in the insomniac nearby. Whether this worked is a question one might also ask about whether a live owl was a practical bedroom companion, and the answer to the second question makes the first question largely academic. The weasel appears in medieval sleep remedies in ways that are harder to rationalise even by the standards of sympathetic medicine. The weasel was associated in medieval natural history with cunning, quickness, and the ability to pass through extremely small spaces, qualities that seem to have nothing to do with sleep. But in some folk medicine traditions, the weasel's ability to pass through barriers was understood as a power that could be applied to the barrier that seemed to stand between the insomniac and sleep, and a weasel-derived preparation was recommended as a way of helping the patient slip through that barrier. This is sympathetic magic operating at a fairly high level of abstraction, and it is not entirely surprising that the weasel cure does not appear in the more academically respectable medical literature. For the insomniac whose sleeplessness was understood to have a spiritual rather than physical cause, the prescribed treatment moved entirely out of the medical domain and into the religious one, and spiritual insomnia cures were, in some cases, not just therapeutically interesting, but genuinely extraordinary as cultural phenomena. The first step in spiritual insomnia treatment was confession. If your sleeplessness had a spiritual cause, if it reflected an unquiet conscience, an unresolved sin, a spiritual disruption, then the appropriate first response was to address the spiritual disruption directly. The sacrament of confession, in the medieval Catholic framework, reconciled the penitent with God and removed the spiritual burden that might be expressing itself as sleeplessness. Many medieval accounts of miraculous healing from various conditions begin with the sufferer going to confession, which in the medical framework made complete sense as the first step in treatment for spiritually caused illness. The recitation of specific liturgical prayers at specific times was prescribed not just as a general devotional practice, but as a targeted medical intervention for spiritual insomnia. The night offices of the monastic schedule, which we've discussed at length, were partly designed around the understanding that the night hours were spiritually significant and that prayer at those hours addressed exactly the kind of spiritual disturbances that produced nocturnal unrest. For the more serious and persistent spiritual insomnia, pilgrimage was recommended. Not just any pilgrimage, Specific healing shrines associated with specific saints were considered effective for specific conditions, and insomnia and nervous disorders of the sleeping kind had their own shrine destinations. Shrines associated with saints who had themselves practiced exceptional fasting and vigil, who had demonstrated extraordinary mastery of the relationship between body, sleep, and spiritual discipline, were particularly recommended for sleep disorders. The most remarkable form of spiritual insomnia treatment was incubation. This was the practice of sleeping at a saint's shrine, specifically requesting a healing dream or vision, and receiving in the dream the information, healing, or divine intervention that would cure the presenting complaint. Incubation was an ancient practice. It was performed at the healing temples of the Greek god Asclepius in antiquity, and it was absorbed into Christian practice in modified form, with saints' tombs and reliquary shrines replacing the pagan temples. To perform incubation for insomnia, you would travel to the appropriate shrine. You would pray, fast if required, make your petition known to the saint. You would then sleep at the shrine, actually lying down in the shrine building, sometimes directly on or near the tomb of the saint. And in your sleep, it was hoped, you would receive either a healing vision that would address the spiritual cause of your insomnia, or sometimes simply a night of unexpectedly good sleep that could be credited to the saint's direct intervention in your condition. The accounts of incubation cures preserved in medieval saints' lives and miracle collections are fascinating documents. They describe people arriving at shrines after years of sleeplessness, sleeping at the shrine, waking cured. The testimonies are sincere. Something was happening at these shrines, whether the placebo power of concentrated expectation, the exhaustion of a pilgrimage journey producing genuine sleep, the psychological effect of having done everything possible and surrendered the outcome, or something else entirely, is a question the records do not allow us to answer definitively. Having spent considerable time with the confident remedies and the elaborate treatment protocols, let us pause and acknowledge something that appears in the medieval medical literature with a frequency that is both surprising and rather endearing. The moment when a physician admitted that their treatments were not working and tried something completely different. Medieval medicine, for all its elaborate theoretical framework, was practiced by people who were paying attention to outcomes. Not systematically, not with controlled trials, not with the statistical tools of modern evidence-based medicine, but with the ordinary empirical attention of an intelligent person watching whether their interventions produced the effects they were supposed to produce, and sometimes, clearly, they didn't. There are passages in medieval medical texts that read across the centuries as genuine expressions of clinical frustration. The physician who notes that the valerian preparation produced no improvement in the patient's sleep. The physician who records that the dietary adjustments and the bath and the lodestone and the charm were all tried without success, and now something else must be attempted. The physician who writes with a brevity that speaks volumes that a particular insomniac patient was difficult to treat. The most honest of the medieval medical writers on insomnia acknowledged a category of the condition that could not be cured by any of the standard interventions, because its cause was not physical, not dietary, not astrological, and not demonic. It was psychological in a way that the medieval framework had difficulty fully accommodating. The insomniac who lay awake because they were worried about something did not have a humoral imbalance that a herb could correct. They had a worry, and the worry would produce sleeplessness until the worry was resolved. Some medieval physicians made remarkably direct recommendations in response to this type of insomnia. Stop worrying, they advised. This is easier to write in a medical text than to accomplish in a life, and the better medieval physicians seem to know this. The practical advice they offered for managing the anxious insomniac was not very different from what a modern cognitive behavioural therapist might suggest. Avoid engaging with the worrying thoughts at night. Distract the mind with gentle content. Address the underlying concern during the day when you have the resources to address it, rather than at night when you do not. The recommendation to keep a specific period during the day for addressing worrying thoughts, rather than allowing them to accumulate and intrude on the night, appears in at least one medieval medical text in terms that are sufficiently clear to constitute a description of what modern sleep medicine calls stimulus control therapy. You put the worry in its place during the day. You give the night a different purpose. You train the association between the bed and rest, rather than between the bed and anxiety. This medieval physician was working entirely without the theoretical framework of modern sleep medicine. He had no concept of conditioned arousal, no understanding of why the association between bed and wakefulness develops, and how it can be changed. But he was observing accurately, and his empirical observation produced a recommendation that anticipates by several centuries a technique that modern sleep medicine considers highly effective. The medieval physician who gave up on the medical approach and told the insomniac to go on a pilgrimage was perhaps less empirically grounded. But even this recommendation contains the germ of something sensible. The pilgrimage removed the insomniac from the environment in which their insomnia had developed, disrupted the routines and associations that maintained it, introduced physical exhaustion through travel, and placed the person in a community of expectation and ritual that had its own psychological power. Pilgrimage as an insomnia cure is not good medicine by modern standards, but it is a more sophisticated intervention than it looks, and the medieval physician recommending it was not being irresponsible so much as reaching for the most powerful tool available in a domain where the standard tools had failed. Medieval insomnia treatment devoted considerable attention to the physical environment of the sleeping space, on the theory that the correct bedroom environment would promote the conditions for sleep in the same way that the correct dietary and herbal interventions promoted those conditions from within. The temperature of the bedroom was a primary concern. We have established that medieval bedrooms were cold by modern standards, but within the range of what was achievable with the available heating technology, there was genuine variation and genuine medical recommendation about the optimal temperature for sleep. Too cold prevented the moistening vapours from rising properly from the stomach. Too hot kept the brain in the overheated state that produced choleric insomnia. Moderate warmth, the warmth of a low fire that heated the air without making it oppressive, was the prescribed condition. The fire management for the insomniac's bedroom was therefore a specific medical concern. The fire should be maintained at a level that kept the room moderately warm through the night, fed with wood that burned slowly and without excessive smoke. Certain woods were considered better than others for the sick and sleeping. Applewood was recommended in some sources for its pleasant scent, which contributed to the aromatic environment of the bedroom in therapeutically favourable ways. Pine and resinous woods were considered less suitable because their strong aromatic compounds might stimulate rather than calm. The darkness of the bedroom was specified. Darkness was considered essential for sleep. Light kept the vital spirits in their waking, outward-oriented state, rather than allowing them to withdraw inward as sleep required. But not complete darkness. A complete absence of light was associated with the domain of demons and with the specific fears of the night that contributed to anxiety-based insomnia. A very small amount of light, the glow of a single small candle, the light of a lamp turned very low, the light of a fire reduced to coals was considered the optimal condition. Enough light to prevent the absolute darkness that produced fear. Not enough light to prevent the dimness that promoted sleep. The scent of the bedroom was managed through the placement of aromatic materials near the sleeping space. We have already discussed lavender and chamomile as materials used in this way. The full medieval sleep-promoting aromatic toolkit extended further. Dried rose petals, which were cooling and pleasant. Dried violets, similarly cooling. Pine resin burned in small quantities before sleep to purify the air. Certain resins and gums that produced aromatic smoke, with specific cooling qualities when burned as incense. The prohibition on certain scents in the bedroom is equally interesting. Strong onion and garlic smell was prohibited for the heat-based insomniac, both because these were heating foods and because their aromatic compounds were considered stimulating to the vital spirits. Strong floral scents, not the gentle scents of rose and lavender, but the heavier scents of certain exotic aromatics, were considered potentially stimulating rather than sedating. The bedroom was supposed to smell gentle, cool, and soft. Nothing that demanded attention. Nothing that excited the senses. The arrangement of the bed within the room was specified in some medical texts with reference to the directional theories of humoral medicine and astrology. The head should be positioned away from the north, which was associated with cold and with certain planetary influences that could disturb sleep in susceptible constitutions. The east was favoured in some traditions because it faced the rising sun, which represented the regeneration that sleep was supposed to produce. These recommendations varied enough between sources to suggest that the directional theories were not universally agreed upon, and the practical variations of room layout probably meant that most people slept in whatever orientation the room permitted. The sounds of the bedroom were managed where possible. Medieval medical writers noted the effect of sound on sleep, a principle that the modern world has developed into an industry of white noise machines and sleep playlists, but which the medieval physician addressed with the available tools. A fire producing a low, consistent crackling was considered soporific. The monotonous, familiar sound contributing to the same quality of gentle sensory occupation that the psalm recitation and the chronicle reading provided. The sound of running water was recommended where available. The sound of wind in a consistent register was acceptable. What was not acceptable was irregular, startling, or meaningful sound. The barking of dogs disturbed sleep both physically and because it triggered an alerting response that reversed the withdrawal of the vital spirits. human voices speaking meaningfully nearby were problematic because they engaged the hearing and, through the hearing, the mind. The crying of children disrupted sleep so consistently and so effectively that the medieval household with infants was a household with a particular sleep problem that no medical text could fully address, because the cause was both unavoidable and not amenable to herbal treatment. If you wanted the best insomnia treatment available in medieval Europe, you went to a monastery. Not because monks were necessarily better physicians than secular practitioners, though many of them were, but because monasteries were where the knowledge lived. The great monastic libraries of the medieval period preserve the ancient medical texts that form the foundation of medieval medicine, and the monastic infirmaries that treated sick monks, and in many cases the local community, were where the most sophisticated pharmacological knowledge was applied. The monastic herbarium, the herb garden maintained by every self-respecting monastery, was a working pharmaceutical facility. The herbs grown there were selected specifically for their medicinal properties, cultivated according to the best available knowledge of their requirements, harvested at the correct seasons, and in some cases at the correct lunar phases, and prepared according to recipes that had been refined across generations of monastic practice. The infirmarian, the monk responsible for the health of the community, was a trained medical practitioner whose training included not just the theoretical humoral framework, but the practical knowledge of which plants to grow, how to prepare them, and what doses to use for specific conditions. The monastic community had a particular practical need for effective insomnia remedies, because the monastic schedule, with its requirement to rise in the small hours for the night office, meant that monks were chronically sleep deprived by design. The community that rose at 2 a.m. for matins and retired again afterward had a structural relationship with interrupted sleep that made the management of sleep quality a practical institutional concern rather than just a medical one. The monastic pharmaceutical response to this institutional sleep challenge was impressive. Monastic pharmacopoeias, the lists of available medicinal preparations maintained by infirmarians, consistently include a range of sleep remedies that reflect both sophisticated herbal knowledge and practical empirical testing. The preparations used in monastic infirmaries were not based purely on ancient authority. They were tested on real patients with real sleeplessness, and the ones that worked were kept, and the ones that didn't were modified or abandoned. The detailed records kept by some monastic infirmaries provide a remarkable window into medieval insomnia treatment in practice. We know from these records what was prescribed, in what quantities, for which patients, and in some cases with what result. The records are not statistical analyses. They are the accounts of individual cases, written in the slightly clinical shorthand of a busy infirmarian dealing with multiple patients, but they are enough to show that the monastic approach to insomnia treatment was empirically grounded in a way that distinguishes it from purely theoretical medicine. One particularly well-documented monastic tradition is the use of composite preparations, blends of multiple medicinal herbs combined in specific proportions for specific conditions. The composite sleep preparation, preserved in several monastic manuscript traditions, typically combined a base of cooling herbs with additions of mild sedatives and aromatic herbs for palatability. The proportions were not random. They reflected accumulated experience, of which combinations worked well together and which produced undesirable interactions. The transmission of this knowledge between monasteries, through the copying of manuscripts, through the movement of monks between communities, through the correspondence that connected the great monasteries of Europe into an intellectual network, meant that successful insomnia remedies developed in one location could spread across the continent over time. A preparation developed at Monte Cassino might appear in modified form in the infirmary at Canterbury a century later, carrying with it whatever accumulated practical wisdom had been added at each stage of transmission. We've spent considerable time with the physicians and their theories and their preparations. Let us now consider the experience from the other side, the experience of the medieval insomniac seeking treatment. Imagine yourself as a prosperous medieval tradesman in a mid-sized English town in the 14th century. You have not slept properly in 3 weeks. You lie awake at night with your thoughts racing. You fall asleep briefly and wake again. And in the morning you are exhausted and irritable, and your work is suffering. Your wife has suggested that perhaps you're under some kind of spiritual attack. Your neighbour has recommended a charm. Your body feels wrong in a way you cannot precisely describe. The first consultation with the physician was, in a larger town, a formal affair. The physician was a trained professional, educated at a university, possessed of extensive theoretical knowledge, and entitled to charge significantly for his services. The consultation began not with the patient describing symptoms, but with the physician observing the patient, the colour of the face, the quality of the pulse, the appearance of the eyes, the character of the urine, which the patient was expected to bring to the consultation in a glass vessel for inspection. The physician was reading the humoral balance of the body through its physical signs before the patient had said a word. The questions followed. When did the sleeplessness begin? At what time of night was the waking most persistent? What were the dreams when sleep occurred? What was the diet? What was the state of the bowels? Were there fears or griefs or angers in the patient's life? Had there been any unusual experiences, any sense of presence in the bedroom, any sounds unexplained, any sense of spiritual disturbance? The interview was comprehensive. The physician was building a picture that was simultaneously physical, psychological, and spiritual. The prescription that followed was typically multi-element, dietary changes, and herbal preparation, possibly a physical treatment, possibly a charm or prayer recommendation. The patient left with specific instructions and a preparation from the physician's own pharmacy or a direction to the apothecary. The cost was significant. A full consultation with a university-trained physician was beyond the means of most people, which is why most people with insomnia did not see a physician at all. The more common recourse was the local apothecary, or the local wise woman or man who maintained herbal knowledge outside formal medical training. These practitioners offered cheaper consultations, simpler preparations, and a mixture of herbal, folk, and magical treatments that the formally trained physician might have considered beneath his professional dignity. But they were accessible, and they were often effective in the specific sense that they provided some relief for conditions that the elaborate humoral treatments also failed to cure. The wise woman's insomnia remedy was likely a preparation she had made many times before, given to many patients, tested against many cases of sleeplessness. She knew from experience which herbs helped and which didn't. She knew which patients needed the valerian preparation and which needed the chamomile and which needed to be told directly that their problem was a worry they needed to resolve, rather than a humoral imbalance she could correct. She practiced medicine in the practical sense, helping people based on observation of what helped people, without the theoretical framework that the university physician brought to the same problems. The tension between formal and informal medicine is a thread running through the entire medieval medical tradition, and it is particularly visible in the insomnia literature. The formal physicians wrote at length about humours and vapours and astrological timing. The folk medicine collections record that rubbing your feet with goose fat and saying a specific rhyme before lying down helped somebody's grandmother sleep through the winter. And here is the rhyme. Both types of knowledge were being generated simultaneously, applied to the same problem, evaluated against the same criterion of whether the patient eventually slept. All of these remedies, the herbs, the amulets, the baths, the prayers, the dietary adjustments, the dormouse fat, the live owl in the corner, the slow recitation of chronicles, were tried by real people against real sleeplessness. And in many cases, they helped. In many cases, they didn't. The medieval insomniac, for whom nothing worked, faced a situation that the medical literature addressed with varying degrees of honesty. The physician who had exhausted the standard repertoire might escalate to more powerful preparations, the dangerous territory of mandrake and henbane and opium, the preparations that worked definitively and whose margins of safety were narrow. The physician who was more cautious or more empirically honest might acknowledge that the condition was beyond what medicine could address and redirect the patient towards spiritual treatment. The spiritual pathway for the persistent insomniac: confession, prayer, pilgrimage, incubation at a shrine, was in some ways more accepting of failure as an outcome than the medical pathway. Medicine promised to correct the imbalance and restore normal function. Religion offered meaning rather than mechanism. Perhaps the sleeplessness was a trial, a spiritual discipline, a purification. Perhaps it was an invitation to the kind of nocturnal prayer that the monks practiced by choice. Perhaps the sleeplessness itself was a form of spiritual communication, the divine keeping the person awake for purposes that would become clear with time and prayer. This reframing of insomnia as potentially spiritually meaningful rather than simply medically problematic is a coping strategy that, stripped of its specific theological content, is recognizable in modern approaches to chronic sleep difficulty. The instruction to change your relationship to the wakefulness rather than fighting it, to stop treating the waking hours as a battle you are losing and start treating them as simply hours that you're experiencing, is a technique that modern cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia uses with good evidence for effectiveness. Medieval spiritual direction arrived at a structurally similar recommendation from a completely different direction. The insomniac who had tried everything and found nothing definitively helpful was eventually left with the same situation that many modern insomniacs find themselves in. The condition was somewhat managed, somewhat accepted, somewhat endured, Some nights were better than others. Some remedies helped sometimes. The valerian preparation took the edge off on bad nights. The psalm recitation occupied the mind during the longer wakings. The morning light brought relief that was genuine even when it was temporary. The medieval night was long, and the medieval insomniac knew the whole of it in intimate detail. The way the darkness changed in quality between midnight and dawn, the specific sounds that populated the small hours, the way the cold deepened before it began to lift, the particular quality of the light through the window, shutters that announced the approaching dawn. They knew things about the night that the sound sleeper never knew, and carried that knowledge with them through the day in the particular way of people who have spent many hours keeping company with the dark. In this way, across the centuries and across the vast difference in understanding and practice, the medieval insomniac and the modern one recognise each other. The wakefulness is the same, the desire for sleep is the same, the turning over of thoughts that will not quiet, the listening for sounds, the watching of the dark for its incremental changes toward dawn. These are not experiences that have changed. What has changed is the repertoire of responses. The dormouse fat has been set aside, the lodestone has been put away, the physician who recommended the live owl in the corner has been retired. The valerian, interestingly, is still available. The warm drink before bed is still recommended, and the slow, gentle voice in the dark telling you things that are interesting enough to occupy the mind without exciting it, following the same principle that the medieval physician described with such accuracy, while getting the mechanism so completely wrong that, as you may have noticed, is still very much in use. You are, in this moment, benefiting from a treatment protocol that was documented in the 13th century. The delivery mechanism has changed somewhat. The content has been updated. The dormouse fat is not involved. But the principle is the same. A quiet voice, a gentle cadence, something to listen to that is more interesting than your own thoughts, but less interesting than the day. It works then. It is working now. Sleep well. Water featured prominently in medieval insomnia treatment in ways that go considerably beyond the simple warm bath we discussed earlier. The medieval relationship with water as a therapeutic substance was complex, partly because of the competing medical and religious theories about whether bathing was beneficial or harmful, and partly because water in various forms, drunk, bathed in, applied topically, blessed, mineral enriched, was understood to have different therapeutic properties depending on its source, temperature and preparation. The mineral spa tradition that we associate most strongly with the Victorian period had deep medieval roots. Natural mineral springs across Europe were recognised in the medieval period as having specific therapeutic properties, and the spa towns that grew up around them attracted both the genuinely ill and the fashionably well who wanted to maintain their health. The springs at Bath in England, at Aachen in Germany, at various locations across France and Italy, these were medical destinations recommended by physicians for specific conditions, visited by patients following medical advice. Sleeplessness was one of the conditions for which mineral bathing was recommended, particularly for the hot, dry, choleric type of insomnia. The theory was straightforward within the humoral framework. Mineral waters were cooling and moistening. The springs came from deep within the earth, where the humoral qualities were balanced and pure, and immersion in the water would correct the excess heat and dryness that prevented sleep. The correct mineral spring for insomnia was therefore a spring with cold, moist properties. Springs with sulphurous qualities were generally considered too heating, while springs with iron content were considered more balanced and therefore more suitable. The protocol for mineral bathing as insomnia treatment was specific. The bathing should occur in the late afternoon or early evening, so that its therapeutic effects would be active at the time of sleep. The duration should be sufficient for the mineral properties to penetrate the skin. An hour was commonly recommended, sometimes more. The temperature should be warm but not hot. After the bath, the patient should rest quietly. Avoid stimulating food. Drink a moderate amount of warm herbal preparation and proceed to bed while the therapeutic effects were still active. For those without access to mineral springs, prepared baths with added medicinal substances were the alternative. The infirmarian preparing a therapeutic bath for an insomniac monk would add specific herbs to the bath water: chamomile, lavender, rose petals, and in some preparations specific mineral substances purchased from apothecaries and dissolved in the water. The prepared bath was less potent than a natural mineral spring by the logic of the period, but it was the available approximation. Cold water also appeared in insomnia treatment, though primarily as a shock therapy for a specific type of sleeplessness, rather than as a general remedy. For patients whose sleeplessness was accompanied by fever, where the insomnia was secondary to an underlying febrile condition, cold water applied to the head and face was recommended as a way of rapidly reducing the heat that was preventing sleep. This is actually sound medical practice even by modern standards. Reducing a fever with cool water applied to the face and forehead does lower body temperature and can provide enough relief from the discomfort of fever to allow sleep. The medieval physician who recommended cold water for this specific type of heat-based insomnia was observing accurately even if the theoretical framework was wrong. The blessing of water added a spiritual dimension to the water cure that aligned the physical treatment with the religious worldview. Holy water, water blessed by a priest, was sprinkled on the bed and around the sleeping space as a protective measure we have already discussed, but it was also sometimes drunk as a mild therapeutic preparation. The medicinal value of blessed water was attributed to the spiritual qualities added to the water by the blessing rather than to any physical change the blessing produced. But in a world where spiritual and physical reality were continuous, the distinction was not sharp. The dew collected before dawn was recommended in some folk traditions for various medical preparations, including sleep remedies. Morning dew was associated with the cooling quality of the night air and with the period of transition between night and day that had particular magical significance in many folk traditions. Dew collected on specific plants. Traditionally, dew collected on elder or on rose leaves was considered to carry the properties of the plant as well as the properties of the night air, making it a specifically sleep-promoting substance worth including in preparations. Whether dew collected before dawn has any particular pharmacological difference from water collected at other times is not a question that invites a positive answer, but the collection ritual itself had a quality of intentional attention that may have contributed to whatever calming effect the use of the preparation produced. The use of sound and music to promote sleep is so ancient that its medieval manifestations seem almost obvious in retrospect. But the specificity with which medieval physicians and folk practitioners deployed musical and rhythmic tools for insomnia is worth examining in detail, because it reveals a sophisticated, intuitive understanding of how sound interacts with the sleeping brain that anticipates modern neuroscience by several centuries. The lullaby is the oldest and most universal sleep sound technology in human culture. Every known human culture has produced lullabies, songs sung specifically to promote sleep in infants. And the musical characteristics of lullabies across cultures are remarkably consistent despite the enormous differences in melodic tradition. They are slow, they are rhythmically regular, they are melodically simple, moving in small intervals rather than dramatic leaps. They are repetitive. The words, where they're sung in languages that allow comprehension, are either soothing in content or completely meaningless, pure sound vehicles whose semantic content is irrelevant to their function. Medieval lullabies survive in manuscript sources and show exactly these characteristics. The English lullabies preserved from the 13th and 14th centuries are slow, gentle, repetitive, melodically restricted, and often use nonsense syllables or extremely simple repeated words. The Latin lullabies found in religious manuscripts are similarly constructed, sometimes setting fragments of liturgical text to the same slow rocking melodic style. The lullaby crosses the boundary between religious and secular, between Latin and vernacular, between noble and peasant, because the infant's nervous system that it is addressing responds to the same musical features regardless of its social context. The extension of lullaby-style music to adult insomnia was a logical step that appears in several medieval sources. The slow, gentle, rhythmically regular music that calmed infants was recognised as having similar effects on adult nervous systems, and professional musicians were sometimes employed to play quietly in the chambers of noble insomniacs. The music was specifically not stimulating music, not the dance music, or the battle songs, or the elaborate polyphony of formal occasions. It was the simplest available music, played at low volume, with the specific characteristics of slowness and rhythmic regularity that the lullaby embodied. The harp was considered the instrument most suitable for sleep-promoting music in multiple medieval traditions. The harp's resonant, decaying tone, each note sounding and then gently fading without the abrupt cessation of a plucked string, was associated with the same quality of gentle continuation and gentle ending that sleep itself was supposed to bring. The medieval Irish tradition of the harper who played the Lord to sleep was a practical role as well as a literary motif. King David, who played the harp to calm Saul's disturbed spirit in the biblical narrative, was cited as biblical authority for the therapeutic use of music, and the sleep-promoting qualities of David's harp were discussed in medieval musical theory. The drum and other percussion instruments were specifically excluded from sleep-promoting music, for reasons the medieval practitioner observed empirically, and the modern neuroscientist can explain mechanically. Percussive sounds, particularly irregular ones, activate the alerting response, the startle reflex, the orientation response, in ways that prevent rather than promote sleep. Regular, sustained tonal sounds do the opposite. The medieval musician who played harp or lute or recorder quietly in a sleeping chamber was doing something physiologically sound, even if the theory behind the practice involved musical humours and the spiritual power of specific modes rather than the neuroscience of auditory cortex processing. The musical mode in which the sleep-promoting music was played was specified in some medieval sources. Medieval music theory recognised 8 modes, scales with specific intervallic patterns that were considered to produce specific emotional and physical effects. The modes associated with calm, melancholy, and contemplation were recommended for sleep-promoting music. The modes associated with joy and activity were explicitly prescribed. A musician asked to play for an insomniac patient was given not just a genre instruction, but a specific modal instruction. Play in this mode, not that one. For the humoral effects of the mode were considered as real as the humoral effects of an herb. Singing, as opposed to instrumental music, was more complicated for adult sleep promotion. The words of a song engaged the mind in ways that instrumental music did not, which could work either for or against the sleep-promoting intention, depending on the semantic content and the listener's relationship to it. A familiar religious song in which the words were so thoroughly memorized that they produced no active thought was potentially as sleep-promoting as instrumental music. A new song with unfamiliar words or a song with emotionally engaging content was potentially counterproductive. The medieval advice on singing for sleep essentially came to the same conclusion as the advice on reading: familiar, gentle, rhythmically regular, semantically undemanding. The nighttime sounds of the medieval environment that were not deliberately produced also received attention in the insomnia literature. The sound of the church bell marking the canonical hours was a consistent feature of the medieval night in any town or village large enough to have a church. These bells rang at regular intervals through the night, and their effect on sleep was noted with characteristic practicality by medical writers. For some people, the bells were reassuring. The regular marking of time was a reminder that the night was passing, that the darkness was measured and ordered rather than infinite. For others, the bells were disturbing, each ring an interruption of the shallow sleep of the insomniac, each reminder of the time a reminder of how many hours remained until dawn. The medieval solution for bell-disturbed insomniacs was, in essence, to become so accustomed to the bells that they ceased to be heard as startling interruptions and became part of the ambient sound landscape that the brain classified as unthreatening background noise. This is the process of habituation, the neurological mechanism by which repeated exposure to a stimulus reduces the response to it, and the medieval description of it is accurate as an observation, even if the explanation given was that the vital spirits became accustomed to the sound and ceased to respond to it with wakefulness. We have spent considerable time with the physical remedies, the spiritual remedies, the animal-derived remedies, and the musical remedies. But there is one category of medieval insomnia treatment that deserves its own extended discussion, because it represents the closest that medieval medicine came to what we would now recognise as psychological treatment, and it came considerably closer than most people would expect. Medieval physicians were not psychologists. They had no concept of cognitive processes as we understand them. No framework for the unconscious, no vocabulary for the specific mental mechanisms that produce and maintain anxiety-based insomnia. But they were careful observers of human behaviour, and their observations of the insomniac patient produced descriptions of mental states and their relationship to sleep that are recognisable to any modern reader. The category of sleeplessness they called perturbation of the mind covered a range of conditions that we would now distinguish more precisely. Grief that prevented sleep, anxiety about the future that occupied the mind through the night, anger that kept the vital spirits in their agitated, outward-facing state, fear without obvious cause, the medieval equivalent of what we might now call generalized anxiety, and the particular type of mental perturbation that occurred when a person was confronted with a problem they could not solve, a decision they could not make, a situation they could not control. The medieval physician, addressing perturbation of the mind as an insomnia cause, was essentially being asked to help someone whose problem was not biological in any clear sense, and whose treatment could not be a simple prescription. The physician who told the grieving widow to eat cooling foods and apply a lodestone to her pillow was not wrong exactly. The cooling foods were appropriate for her presumed humoral state, and the lodestone was standard protocol. But they were also not addressing the widow's grief, which was the actual cause of her sleeplessness. The better medieval physicians knew this, and the advice they gave for perturbation of the mind as an insomnia cause contained elements of genuine psychological wisdom delivered within a framework that looks strange to modern eyes but is not as different from modern cognitive approaches as it first appears. The recommendation to address worrying thoughts during the day rather than at night, to dedicate specific waking time to the problems that occupied the mind at night, is an approach that appears in multiple medieval medical sources. The logic given was humoral, the day was warm and active, the vital spirits were outward-facing and capable of engaging with difficult material. The humoral state of daylight was appropriate for the confrontation of problems. The night was supposed to be cool and inward-turning, a time of restoration rather than engagement. Using the night for the work of worrying was using the wrong period for the wrong type of activity, in the same way that eating a heavy meal before sleep was using the wrong period for the wrong type of digestion. The language is humoral. The recommendation is recognisably sound. Do your worrying at a specific appointed time during the day. Do not bring it to bed with you. This is stimulus control therapy and cognitive restructuring delivered in the vocabulary of medieval medicine. The recommendation for social engagement as a treatment for grief-based insomnia reflects a similar empirical observation. The medieval physician who told the grieving insomniac to spend time with trusted friends, to avoid solitude in the evening hours, to eat in company rather than alone, was observing that isolation intensified the perturbation of mind, and that company moderated it. The social buffering of emotional distress is a real phenomenon. The presence of trusted others genuinely does regulate the nervous system's response to emotional pain in ways that reduce its sleep-disrupting effect. The medieval physician knew this from observation. The neuroscientist now knows it from the measurement of cortisol levels and amygdala activation. The recommendation is the same. The role of confession in psychological insomnia treatment has a particularly interesting modern parallel. The medieval prescription to confess whatever was troubling the conscience before expecting sleep, to discharge the guilt or the unresolved moral weight that was keeping the mind active, reflects the empirical observation that unresolved psychological material occupies cognitive resources through the night. Modern psychotherapy's emphasis on the therapeutic value of speaking difficult material aloud, of naming and externalizing the internal distress that accumulates in silence, is operating on a related principle. The medieval confessional and the modern therapy session are not the same thing, but the observation that giving voice to what is troubling you helps you sleep is ancient, and it is accurate, and it has been rediscovered and re-explained by every major psychological tradition that has addressed the relationship between mind and sleep. The medieval insomniac seeking help for perturbation of the mind was therefore potentially receiving something more useful than the dormouse fat and the frog eye might suggest. Within the framework of the available tools, there were practitioners, the best physicians, the more perceptive priests, the wiser wise women, who were observing accurately that the relationship between the troubled mind and the sleepless night was not simply a matter of hot humours that herbs could cool. It was a matter of human psychology navigating human difficulty, and the remedies required were the ones that addressed the human difficulty, not just the symptom it produced at night. This is the medieval contribution to insomnia treatment that tends to get overlooked in favour of the more colourful entries on the list. The frog eye is memorable, the honest observation that a person who cannot resolve their grief will continue not to sleep until they find a way to carry it differently is less quotable, but it is more true, and it appears in the medieval medical literature with enough regularity to suggest that it was not a fringe observation, but a recognised clinical reality that the better practitioners knew how to address. And here we are at the end of a very long and very sleepless journey through medieval medicine. You have spent tonight in the company of physicians who knew a great deal about observation and very little about mechanism, who watched carefully and intelligently the things that seemed to help people sleep and the things that seemed to make it worse, and who built theories around their observations that were spectacularly wrong and occasionally accidentally right, who prescribed herbs that worked for reasons they didn't understand, and animals' eyes that didn't work for reasons that seemed perfectly logical, who recommended reading histories in a monotonous voice, and who thereby invented, in the 13th century, the concept that you are currently benefiting from. You have encountered dormouse fat and frog eyes, and harebrains, and owl eggs, and lodestones, and moonstones, and skull powder, and beaver secretions, and a live owl in a bedroom corner. You have met the physician who told his insomniac patient to stop worrying as if this were a practical prescription, and the physician who told his patient to go on a long walk to a distant shrine, which was perhaps better advice than it looked. You have met the honestly frustrated practitioners who noted that their treatments weren't working and tried something else. You have met the astrological physicians calculating planetary hours for the optimal moment to take a Valerian preparation. You have met the monks saying psalms in the dark, and the sleepwalkers whose souls were considered too loosely tethered to their bodies, and the patients sleeping on the cold stones of a saint's tomb and waiting for a healing dream. What runs through all of it, through every bizarre remedy and every misguided theory and every honest admission of failure, is the same thing that runs through all medicine in all periods: the desire to help, the attention to suffering, the willingness to try something, anything, when the person in front of you cannot sleep, and the night is long, and the darkness is full of things that feel threatening even when you cannot name them. Medieval medicine could not cure insomnia. Most of the time, modern medicine cannot cure it either. It can manage it, it can treat contributing factors, but the mystery of why some people lie awake in the dark when others sleep peacefully remains significantly unsolved. The dormouse fat didn't help. The valerian maybe helped a little. The chronicle read in a slow, expressionless voice helped rather more than the physicians realised. And here you are, in the dark, having listened to a long, slow, detailed account of all of this, and perhaps, somewhere in the middle of the section on the astrological theory of full moon insomnia, or the chapter on the dietary management of the choleric temperament, or the long discussion of what specific woods to burn in the bedroom fire, you drifted somewhere softer and quieter. If so, the medieval physician would be satisfied. The method was sound. The mechanism was wrong. The outcome is what matters. Sleep well. Thank you for being here tonight. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment telling me what time it is and where in the world you are watching from. Good night, and good morning when it comes.